Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. 20 years ago, in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of a World Order, Professor Samuel Huntington from Harvard predicted that all future conflicts, wars, and possibly world wars would be over cultural and religious differences. People's cultural and religious identities would remain the main source of a conflict in the post-Cold War world. The fault lines between civilizations would be the battle lines of the future. Has this become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Will wars be fought more among different civilizations rather than nation-states? How do we understand the major conflicts emerging between Islam and the West? And what are the solutions? To address all these issues, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Xudong with the Department of Comparative Literature of New York University. But before we begin, let's take a look at this background report.
Widely deemed as a classic work that will shape political thought for generations, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World was written by the late famous political scientist Samuel Huntington. In this controversial book, Huntington divided the world into 7 or 8 major civilizations, including Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African. He predicted that civilization rather than ideology would be the major source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. Huntington also argued that civilizational conflicts are particularly prevalent between Muslims and non-Muslims, and suggested that in the future the central axis of world politics would tend to be a conflict between Western and non-Western civilizations. In Kishore Mahbubani's phrase, a conflict between the West and the rest. Since its publication in 1996, The Clash of Civilizations has triggered broad debate about relations between the Western and Islamic worlds, especially in the aftermath of the September the 11th attacks on the US, which were viewed by some as the practical onset of the clash of civilizations.
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Zhang. Professor Samuel Huntington drew a lot of fire for the work, The Clash of Civilizations. A lot of people disagree, saying he has exaggerated the fault lines between and among different civilizations, which he said could become the major source of conflicts, even world wars. Do you agree?
Actually, I was one of those who disagreed very strongly with him 20 years ago when the book first came out. And even before that, when he gave his famous speech at the American Enterprise Institute and then published a famous article in Foreign Affairs, I was among those who were virulently against the book. But 20 years later, 20-some years later, I just began to recognize.
You have been proved wrong?
I thought I was wrong and he was right.
Mm-hmm.
And for the following reasons. Not because he advocates as kind of the so-called Machiavellian sort of approach to use force, but first I think I like his realism, just to face the real issues of the world rather than whitewashing or using euphemisms. That's one I like. The other is that I think he has his fingers on some of the deep-seated conflicts, the so-called fault line issue. I think he has been proven correct. But on the other hand, I think the book has been misread and misinterpreted by his proponents and the detractors. If we have time, we can address that as well.
But first of all, do you have a clear definition about what is a civilization? And do you think China is a civilization state or a nation state?
I think it's both. It's Lucien Pai, a MIT political scientist, who came up with this famous line. Says China is a civilization trying to pass as a nation state. I think that line captures the complexity, the ambiguity of China being somewhere between a civilizational state and a nation state.
But then, first of all, your definition about the civilization.
It's a slippery category, but commonsensically we can talk about civilization as the largest common denominator of people who see each other as belonging to the same form of life, way of life, value system, language, culture, historical memories. That's why an Italian and a French may have all the differences in the world, but eventually, by the end of the day, they would see each other as belonging to the same Western civilization. Christianity being one, common history from the Middle Ages, Roman Catholic Church, Reformation, Enlightenment, Renaissance, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, and the list goes on. These shared historical experiences and institutions and religious, cultural foundations give rise to this widely recognized a boundary of this shared sphere of world which we call civilization.
But yet, a European scholar argued famously that perhaps those who claim they share the same civilization live in an imagined community. Have you noticed the controversial argument?
It is. It's true. You can always break down these general categories into an ever smaller categories and concepts. But that does not take the real force away from these shaping forces in the world today, which can sooner or later be traced back to civilizational boundaries. To that extent, I do agree with Samuel Huntington.
The immediate concern for an observer like me who work for the media industry has been using politics and civilizational differences in East Asia as a context to examine what could happen to China politically during the period of transformation. Everybody is talking about whether China would become yet another democracy or it remains an autocracy based on meritocracy. What would be the main hallmarks to tell the differences between the transformation in China and democratization in other young industries and low-income economies on the periphery of China. Therefore, East Asia has fast become a very important concept in drawing a line between the West and the East, particularly in the post-Cold War era, when the United States are so happy dwelling upon the importance of the color revolution and whether China would follow suit, the Arab Spring color revolutions and so on and so forth.
I think part of the reason why this book has been so innovative, regarded as innovative and useful, is that it actually problematizes these Cold War categories and distinctions such as the East versus the West. Because if you take this clash of civilizations seriously, you realize that Huntington suggests that in East Asia alone, there are several civilizational systems, Japan being one. It's not part of the so-called Confucian civilizational sphere. And the Philippines is actually part of the Christian civilizational sphere.
That's a very strong Catholic tradition.
Exactly. And Indonesia and a part of Southeast Asia, for instance, Malaysia, belong to this Islamic civilization. So in East Asia alone, there are at least 4 different civilizations clashing with each other. That's one. That's part of the sort of the civilizational context in East Asia, which is very, very complicated. That already makes the picture fuller, rather than just regarding East Asia as one single block, right, dominated by either this or that particular civilization. No, it's a coexistence of several civilizations. And internally, back to China, I think if you recognize Chinese society as a civilizational one, I think that would eventually lend some force, intellectual force, to the argument that this society is rightfully in search of its own historical trajectory, its own social system. What is good for this civilizational survival or development or identity. It goes without saying. It's implicit in this civilizational-based world order or civilizationally based social development that China should and must seek its own way.
Lee Kuan Yew, late founding father of Singapore, said to Americans as well as perhaps to Asians in the neighborhood that most of the Chinese feel very comfortable with having a very strong central government. That's quite beyond the imagination and reason, logic of most of those in the West who argue that democracy is absolutely non-negotiable and should be the only roadmap for your whatever transformation. What do you think of, the differences between the perception shared by most senior politicians in the East and those in the West who argue for universal values, democracy, free use of a ballot box in deciding the future of a country?
Right. I think this is a case in point, showing that this book, The Clash of Civilizations, has changed the conceptual map of the world, the ways in which people examine these issues. For instance, we just talked about the concept of civilization would endorse, conceptually at least, China seeking its own way. But on the other hand, it also problematizes this state-based one China model, this nationalist model, because Singapore, for instance, is also part of the Chinese civilization. Nevertheless, it has a different social system, it has a different commercial culture, institutional setup. If you look at these East Asia through the lens of civilizational conflict and coexistence, you realize the so-called Chinese civilization possesses internally multiple modes of production, multiple paths of social development. The competition and the cooperation create such opportunities, which eventually, as Samuel Huntington has predicted, would change the balance of world power. And one of his observations, based on his civilizational model, I think, is that the Western moral supremacy or sense of superiority historically is based on the military strength and the technological advantage. As East Asia fast catches up on those fronts, this region, namely East Asia, with Confucian or Chinese civilization at the center of it, will acquire more and more confidence and eventually will be in a place to change the rules.
And yet China is currently at the loggerheads with some of the claimants in the South China Sea. Having said this, why do you think we failed to see major conflicts between different ethnic groups, particularly between Muslims, non-Muslims in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks in the year 2001. Yet in sharp contrast, in the Middle East, we see the rise of Daesh or ISIL, and above all, very radical Islamism in this most volatile region of the Middle East. And such dangerous trends of ideology and ideological violence, sectarian violence threatens to disrupt the social order, the basic principles that shape the European Union, the lone wolf attacks in France and Germany these days. All of these combined give us a very scary picture that extremism arising from political Islamism might be a major threat to peace and stability in the East, particularly in the West. But let's first of all look at why have we been able to have a relatively harmonious social picture in East Asia. Indonesia boasts of the largest Muslim population in the world. ironically, and yet it didn't have any massive anti-US or anti-West demonstrations in the wake of 9/11. Neither did we have such things in Turkey, which experienced the success of Kemalism at the beginning of last century, despite the failed coup in recent weeks.
So you're referring to this phenomenon that the Islam in East Asia or Southeast Asia, it has been relatively peaceful. This book, in this book, Samuel Huntington observes rather darkly that Islam has bloody borders, as simple as that. It's based on historical fact or statistics. He draws this conclusion. But you're absolutely right. In Asia, Islam doesn't seem to have as bloody a history as it has in other regions of the world. That I'm no expert on this issue. But back to China, I think this relative harmony you referred to has something to do with the tradition ever since Chinese Enlightenment. This modernization, the obsession with modernization, the obsession with a universal trajectory of human development, sanctioned very strongly by the communist state, has historically kept the different religious, ethnic differences in check. There has been a prevailing universal high culture in place, which provides a sort of umbrella, overarching value system. But that has been seriously eroded, I think, in recent decades because of uneven development and because of this increasing self-assertiveness inspired or supported by religious differences and competition and even violence in the global context. I think China has already begun to face these problems more visible in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Zhang Xudong with the Department of Comparative Literature of NYU. We are discussing, in fact, we are commemorating the 20th anniversary of the release of a very controversial book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. It was written by Professor Samuel Huntington 20 years ago. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Professor Zhang, let's look at the clashes, very violent clashes between Christianity and Islamism, particularly in the Middle East, if not in continental Europe. We saw terrorist attacks against Charlie Hebdo in Paris and slaughter of dozens of people in a theater in Paris, and again, killing of the priest in the French church recently. Now, such things seem to be gaining momentum and dynamics in scale and size. So what do you think of the very serious civilizations? Is that part of the civilizational rifts?
Yes, the hypothesis of civilizational fault line proposed by Samuel Huntington, he does say that this is a hypothesis. He doesn't say that it's a conclusion, it's a definitive finding or something, but rather a working hypothesis. But this hypothesis helps us to delve deep into the issues at hand, which is in China, at least in the past decades, people tend to believe that as we continue to modernize, to progress, all these social problems and differences, including identity problems, will be solved by development, by means of development, through development. But Islam and its current clash with the West shows, I think, very convincingly and in a very anxiety-causing way that people eventually stand by and live within their civilizational identity. Faith, defined in terms of faith or otherwise, without willing to sacrifice this fundamental identity for the sake of secular, material well-being. So this is something I think it should be something new and alarming to Chinese intellectuals and the Chinese people, because there's a lot of optimism placed within modernization and development.
If a second look at some of the areas of ambiguity may help illuminate the conflicting or messy situations in the Middle East, particularly among the Arab countries and the Turks, the Kurds, and so on and so forth. Why did we see the success of Kemalism in Turkey, whilst the industrialization, success of which was overseen and engineered by the United States in the Persian state of Iran, was pushed back by the 1979 Islamic Revolution under the leadership of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. And that led to the sharp decline in the relationship between Tehran and Washington, because 52 American diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. That's indeed a tragedy, if not something that epitomizes the serious clashes between Christianity and Islamism. What do you think of these two cases? We have to do some case study to illuminate the differences, right?
In Iran, starting with 1979 revolution, and in Turkey, I think these are seminal cases which indicate the resurgence or development, world historical development of Islam, compared to which Westernization appears to be relatively short-lived a moment, eventually to be swamped by this reorientation with one's own religious and cultural traditions and identities. These are, I think, really, really profound world historical developments, and we are only scratching the surface of these issues. Our understanding in China, as well as in the West, is so inadequate, and there's so much to be done in that regard. But if I may, I want to turn to one of the central, I think, teachings of Samuel Huntington's book, which bears significance in today's world. I think, obviously, he wrote this book in the interest of America. He was a loyal sort of a warrior for American global interests. There's no question about it. But implicitly, I think, and increasingly obviously, if you read the book, you realize he's very critical of American policies. I think his argument can boil down to this. Internally, within a country, within a civilization, within a system, you should try to promote integration, unity, universal values, which bring people together. Externally, you should recognize the fact that the world is constituted by different civilizational blocks. And if you want to achieve world peace, you have to recognize the real foundation of a world order. And for him, the real foundation is the coexistence of fundamentally different civilizational blocks. If you take his teachings seriously and look at American domestic and foreign policy, it runs just opposite of Huntington's advice. Internally, it tends to promote diversity, multiculturalism, tolerance, and so on and so forth. In a well-meaning fashion, it's viewed as progressive, democratic, liberal, and so on and so forth. And there are real benefits of that. But externally, America tends to be the advocate for a one-polar, one-standard, kind of a universal world order, with America being its moral anchor. And
that could be the discourse of American exceptionalism, you like it or not. Well, one thing that Professor Samuel Huntington dwells upon in his book, which was completed 5 years after the Cold War to an end in 1991, was it could be a nightmare for Confucianism to join hand with the Islamic Revolution as opposed to Christianity in the post-Cold War era. While China makes friends with all of the member states of the 22-member Arab League, we are no enemy of any of the major players in this Middle East region. The United States and its military interventionism tends to wreak havoc with the Middle East. Therefore, President Obama tends to lead from behind and lead by example instead of getting involved directly and militarily in the regional conflict. So, do you think, on the other hand, the geopolitical comeback of Russia has added to the dynamics in this process of the geopolitical reconfiguration, fueling the rivalry, if any, between a combination of Islamism, Confucianism, and Orthodox Church with Christianity? I mean, this could be yet another major scenario. If not the clashes between different civilizations. Yeah. This is a very general picture, but it's something that captures the hearts and minds of so many who follow the process there.
Right. That part has to do with his strategic thinking and his practical advice to, say, American Department, the State Department or something. That, to me personally, is a less interesting part of his book. If I remember correctly, he gives us a picture of World War III, in which eventually, surprise of all surprises, Japan sided with China, whereas Russia sided with the West. So for him, the fundamental religious differences, it will carry the day. So his sort of a momentary speculation of what if this nightmare sort of a scenario, what if Confucian China civilization teaming up with Islamic civilization? I don't see it as a kind of a likely scenario. China being a secular, materialist, modernizing society might be on the list of Islamic fundamentalists, I mean the hit list of Islamic fundamentalists as well. I mean, to that extent, China clearly is part of the modern, if not secular, if not Western world, right? That for me is.
In fact, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region has become target of the East Turkestan Islamic movement. That is listed as a terrorist organization. So you will have strong doubts about such a combination.
I think it's extremely
or
unlikely.
Alignment.
Yes. Although I think your question raised a very interesting, very thought-provoking issue. To what extent the Islamic hostility toward the West is a sheer religion-based kind of a rivalry or hostility? To some extent, it's caused concretely by Western military, economic, political power and the use of that power. That's a real issue. And your earlier question regarding Islam in the Asian region being relatively calm and non-belligerent, I think also points in this direction.
In fact, you put your finger on a very interesting issue. President Erdogan of Turkey said in an exclusive interview that I conducted last year, he said so seriously to me, Yang Rui, don't label ISIL with Islamic belief. It's wrong. They are not Islamic faith. Well, thank you very much for being part of this very meaningful dialogue on the alleged clash between different civilizations. I promise to bring Professor Zhang back for yet another serious discussion about similar issues. Until then, goodbye.